and I'll just welcome everyone to the first All Eyes on Louisville panel for the spring semester. It's titled Anti-Racist Practices in Corporate Settings, and we're so happy you could join us tonight. I'm Dr. Megan Poole. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a faculty member in the Department of English, and I'm happy to say that this panel is brought to you through a collaboration by the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Anne Braden Institute for Social Justice Research, the Commonwealth Center for the Humanities and Society, and U of L's Black and Brown Honor Society. Now, I have just a brief introduction before the event kicks off. So while I'm doing that, I'd like to invite everyone to enter the chat and make transparent the wonderful community that I see already filing in tonight. So if you would, if you hover your clicker over the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little chat button. Click that chat button and just tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from. Include your name, maybe your organization, the pronouns you prefer, and just a quick snippet about what brings you here tonight and what interests you about this panel. Once you type, make sure to send your remarks to everyone instead of just the panelists. That's a little blue button option you'll see once you start typing your remarks there in the chat. So there are several other groups who made tonight's event possible, including the Departments of Pan-African Studies, Philosophy, Political Science, and Sociology, the Graduate Certificate in Diversity Literacy, the Women's Center, and Pi Sigma Alpha. A special thank you especially to Brandon Harwood for helping us run the SUB webinar, to Dr. Kara Snyder for inviting this panel into the All Eyes on Louisville series, and to Dr. Kate Fossil and Andrea Rodmacher for helping us to spread the word and gather together the community that's here tonight. And I'll just pause and say, Nikki, I can see you. Can you hear and see us okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine. I'm sorry, yes.
Great, great, good. I just wanted to make sure all was good on your end. Okay, a special thank you to the growing cohort in the English department's technical and professional writing interest group, who first asked the question that animates our panel here tonight. How might professionals put anti-racist principles into practice as they enter the workplace? You know, I'm quite new to U of L. I moved here in the fall of 2020. And I moved to the city at a time when, as my wonderful colleague Kara Snyder puts it, all eyes were on Louisville. At a time when the nation was called to bear witness to the social injustices here. At a time when the university publicly stated their anti-racist intentions. And because I was hired to teach in a new track of the English department called Public and Professional Writing, my students and I have been thinking about just what exactly anti-racist work looks like in the workplace. And we haven't found easy answers because, as we know, young professionals are often taught, whether explicitly or implicitly, to keep their heads down, to stay quiet until they're promoted. And we also know that workplace studies have found hiring practices and workplace environments to be racialized, gendered, and generally policed to ensure that new professionals uphold sometimes problematic norms that fall under that term professional. Hoping to work against those norms, this question of how anti-racist work might change the workplace, or at least change how I teach students about the workplace, have been on my mind since I arrived in Louisville. And then in October of last year, my professional writing students and I were given the opportunity to attend a One West board meeting. If you don't know One West, please go look them up as soon as this panel is over. One West is a local nonprofit focused on community and commercial development in West Louisville. And on the surface, One West and CEO Yvonne Smith were opening its doors virtually, of course, so that students could witness a real board meeting in practice. What happened, though, is that the board modeled for us how to let community voices guide your work and how to build one another up in professional settings rather than working on a model of competition. Nikki Lanier, one of the speakers we're honored to have on this panel tonight, is One West's board chair. And the minute I left the board meeting she ran, I knew that there were folks in the community who might think with us and help guide us in our endeavors in this anti-racist work. And one of the excellent undergraduate students in that board meeting with me was Sydney Finley, our moderator for tonight. Sydney's studying political science, English, and peace, justice, and conflict transformation at U of L. She's a McConnell, Woodford R. Porter, and honors scholar. Not only is she actively engaged with the Student Government Association at U of L, but she's also a member of the Student Senate's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, as well as the vice president and co-founder of U of L's Black and Brown Honor Society. Sydney's now an intern for One West, and she hopes to later attend law school to become a civil rights, education, or immigration attorney and policy analyst. She's an inspiring voice of progressive change, and I'm so excited that you get to meet her this evening because hers is a name we will see a lot in the future. Of that, I am sure. So Sydney, I'm going to turn things over to you to introduce our two wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Poole. Thank you for that great introduction. So first, I want to introduce our panelists. Up first, we have Miss Nikki Lanier. She is the Senior Vice President and Regional Executive of the Louisville branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, a branch that covers Metro Louisville, Western Kentucky, and Southern Indiana to focus on community development and education, as well as regional economic research and policy input. Nikki's experience stretches across the nation. Originally from Virginia, Nikki earned a bachelor's degree in journalism from Hampton University and then went on to earn a JD from the University of Miami School of Law. She has served as the personal cabinet secretary for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, chief human resources officer for the Charter Schools USA in South Florida, Vice Chancellor of Human Resources for Maricopa Community Colleges in Arizona, and various other positions in which she focused on strategic planning, community partnerships, equitable workplace practices, and mediations and labor negotiations. In 2019, Nikki was presented with the Robert C. Burks Distinguished Business and Leadership Award. The year prior, she was featured in the Business Journal's Influencers as one of the top 100 executives having an impact on business and local communities. Louisville Business First has also named her as one of 20 people to know in banking and finance, as well as one of the 10 most influential women of Louisville. Such accomplishment. A leader in community bridge building, Nikki currently serves on boards in Louisville and across the state, including One West, as Dr. Poole had mentioned previously. So now moving on to Ms. Victoria Russell. She is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Beam Suntory, the owner of the iconic Jim Beam and Maker's Mark bourbon brands. She has earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and an MBA in marketing from the University of Kentucky. In 2006, Victoria became the first Chief of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Papa John's International Incorporated. And just last month, she became the first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Beam Suntory. Prior to Papa John's, Victoria held compensation and marketing roles at Lexmark, Humana, and Brown-Forman. Victoria serves on nonprofit boards across the city, including Leadership Louisville, Fund for the Arts, and Women Influencing Louisville. She was featured in the Business Journal's Influencers on a national list of rising stars and an influential list of young executives. More recently, she was inducted into the Leadership Louisville Class of 2020, given the University of Kentucky's 2019 Lyman T. Johnson Torch of Excellence Award. Honored as a Daughter of Greatness by the Muhammad Ali Center and featured as Today's Woman 2020 Most Admired Woman in the corporate category. In her new role at Beam Suntory, Victoria will work with leadership to prioritize diversity and inclusion in talent acquisition, career development, and employee retention, marketing, and community relations, as well as building organizational structures to better recognize bias and drive inclusive mindsets. Both Victoria and Nikki have also been selected as part of Louisville's 40 Under 40, and we are honored to have them with us tonight. So, all right, I'm going to kick off our roundtable session, and then just to let everyone know, if you go, it's next to the chat button where it says Q&A. That's where we're going to be having questions. There's going to be a time for us to ask audience questions later on after this sort of like panel session. So feel free to do that. And you can also upvote questions as well in the chat if there's a question someone asked that you really like. Alrighty, so the first question is, Ibram X. Kendi's now famous definition of an anti-racist individual is someone who is actively opposing racism by supporting policies and practices that reduce racial inequity. Given you all's experiences in corporate settings, do you think this idea of anti-racism and the need for anti-racist principles in the workplace is widespread? And have you seen this idea grow in prevalence in the workplace over the years? And whoever wants to start us off can go ahead.
Well, I'll jump in. I think the idea is widespread. I think often from what I've seen is it's easy to accept in theory, but more difficult to put into practice. And I think often those that don't fall in those marginalized communities find it a little difficult when things start to create balance. Part of the equity work is to remove barriers, right, and correct the imbalances that exist. And that can be a painful process because often people may feel like they may not be aware or fully understand that they might have benefited, right, from different advantages through the years. And that imbalance, when you start to correct it, can be a little painful. So I think that is what often creates some of the difficulties in doing that work. I think 2020, if nothing else, all the civil unrest and racial injustice has really accelerated the conversation in a lot of corporate workspaces. And so people are now talking about it. Team members are very vocal now. Black team members in particular are sharing how they feel. They're leaving their organizations. And as companies really focus on recruitment efforts, particularly around Black talent, you know, it's a lot easier to lose them. So it's difficult to retain them in your organization if you're not getting it right. And those organizations that either appear to be doing it much better, offering the pay, the title, the position, right? They're easy to pull your talent away. So I think companies are starting to definitely feel the pain of that, starting to focus on it. My only fear is that, you know, we don't lose momentum in doing this work, right? That the conversation doesn't slow down and companies somehow go back to business as usual, right? Or don't maintain their focus here.
Oh, okay. Thanks for the question, Sydney. And let me just first say that I am so incredibly impressed with you, girl, Sydney. Seriously, I remember talking to you after that One West meeting that you came to, and I was so freaking impressed with all of who you are and how you handled yourself. And I just am so appreciative of this opportunity to talk to you and talk about this very important topic with my sister, Victoria. We have been in this fight and having these discussions for years and years and years. Okay, so let me answer your question. Maybe I'll get around to doing that. That'd be nice. I think I'm a little more jaded, perhaps, than Victoria. I don't know that I have seen or experienced much by way of headwinds in corporate settings around anti-racism, except for as of last year. So what I have noticed and what I think is true of our history in this country is that there is a reckoning and an awakening, the kind of uh-oh proverbial moment that happens in dominant white cultures after lots and lots of blood is shed. Like literally blood has to be shed for some sort of reckoning and an awakening to follow. So where I think that we have made progress historically is in the diversity space. So I think companies have gotten better at just bringing in people of different ethnicities, sexual orientation, backgrounds. I think we've gotten better at the who of it, but not necessarily the belonging piece, which gets you to the inclusion, and then certainly not in the activism space that anti-racism work requires. I think that even now, that's a slow-moving ship. I think that there's a lot of scurrying about and urgency, rightfully so and appropriately so, to try to get this right. But I think my fear, I'll build on what Sydney was talking about. My fear is that we're taking, we're trying to close this gap, this equity gap. We don't have a lot of time. You know, it took us hundreds and hundreds of years to get to this point, and it was a slow moving train to get us to diversity, maybe even a little bit of inclusion, not really much by way of equity. Anti-racism, forget it. So, but we've got to get from the diversity to anti-racism quickly. Like that's an economic argument why we need to get there. I'm happy to talk about that later, but we've got to get there quickly. And so we don't have another couple of hundred years to try to close that gap. So, you know, I think that we've got a lot of work to do and that there's a lot of interest in and curiosity around, but I think our sophistication around understanding what it really means to actively work against systems and ideology and frameworks of racism, I think that we've got a long way to go on that.
And that last part that you talked about, Ms. Nikki, it goes into my next question, which is why you all think anti-racism is often easy to overlook in corporate or professional settings. And even Victoria, you talked about how it's sort of, it's apparent because of things that are happening in like the world around us outside of the corporate realm. And then people, like social media is a great example of, you see everyone posting black squares, and then now it's like everyone's Instagram feeds are back to normal. So I guess, why do you think we see that in the corporate world?
Nikki, you look like, go ahead, you're on mute.
Okay, I'll take it real quick, then I'll lob it over to you. Okay, so why do we say, so I think it's because most of our corporations are led largely by white males who've had a very white male experience, lived experience. Understanding that how I traverse and how you, Sydney, and Victoria traverse through the world, irrespective of our academic rooting or where we may have traveled or who our mama was, like irrespective of all of that, there's still the reality of a very stark difference in the presumptions that we meet and their stereotypes and the judgments that we meet every single day that most white people just don't have any experience or exposure to. And so white social norms have helped to really shape how corporations exist and subsist. And they've shaped their priorities around how we think about what matters and what does not. So I think it's not wanton, reckless indifference. I just think it's negligence born out of ignorance. Now, from this point forward, in my mind, if you're not really advancing the ball, then it is wanton and reckless negligence, because there's no reason why you cannot figure this out at this point. But I think that there's a piece of this that a lot of folks have just been kind of ignorant around, because it's just not been anti-racism work. It's just not been a part of their nomenclature. And then let me just say this, and then I'll shut up so Victoria can share her perspective. I also think about how important the nomenclature is. So you think about in most workplaces, we are just now getting to the point where we can say Black people and white people and racism at work. Like before, that was in the bathroom corner somewhere. And you have employees that are kind of whispering the word. And so just to be bold enough to talk about, listen, I'm experiencing racism. I feel like I'm experiencing some difference because of my skin color. There's a Black norm and then there's a white norm. There are white people and there are Black people, and there's just differences that come with that. We're so uniquely rooted around assuring that we all feel the same, that there's the similarity and the sameness. And while that's true, swimming in that place allows us to fall into this ridiculous malaise where we don't really acknowledge that the differences where we are different matter in terms of livelihood. They matter in terms of a sense of security and safety. They matter in terms of belonging. They matter in terms of how much innovation and discretionary effort I'm permitted to bring to work versus some of my colleagues. So those are the things that I think have kind of prevented us from getting to a point where anti-racism principles and even the word, that nomenclature, could really take root at work.
I absolutely agree with Nikki. I think no one was really at mass having this conversation as broadly as they probably did in 2020. And when I say no one, I'm particularly talking about our white colleagues and friends and family, right? So I think there was this thought of, I'm not racist versus being anti-racist, right? So this actively part that's in there wasn't natural for people. And I think they felt they were already doing enough, those that were doing anything, right? But I think you still have these pockets that don't see it. And that's the part for, as a Black woman, and we're, in this work and in these conversations, it's shocking sometimes when you hear someone say either they don't see racism at all, or they don't believe it exists in their organizations. They don't understand that it is in the systems and practices and procedures and policies and things, right? And sometimes is it the wording that you have to be a little more digestible, right? And taking them on this journey of understanding and how you do it. And that's kind of some of the finesse I think people who work in this space have to figure out. I had the privilege of sitting in a leadership or CEO roundtable last week, led by Marion Vassar and Michael Wade Smith, and they did a phenomenal job. And they showed a great example where you see this track of the white male, and he's got like 2 hurdles, and this Black female who has like a boulder, a ball and chain on her ankle, barbed wire, right? She's got this crazy path. And so I love how they began. They just asked people to reflect how they feel about it. And so hearing some of the different perspectives was a little interesting, how people see it. You know, some comments first said, you know, it assumes that the white male didn't have barriers, right? That he didn't have the same obstacles. And I think Marion does a great job of, you know, well, I don't think that's what it says at all, but that's how someone perceived it, right? But rather, you know, being Black, the color of your skin isn't one of them. So we're not saying that you don't, you know, you might not have grown up in poverty or didn't have a two-parent household or all the things, right, that kind of make us who we are. But when you walk into the room, your skin color is not a part of it. You know, I've shared with some of my, you know, white colleagues and friends, you know, often I didn't come from, you know, humble beginnings. My parents both worked, had great jobs, both educated. You know, I've educated, degreed, all my sisters, right? Those weren't challenges. Grew up in a great part of town. But when I walk into the room, I'm still a Black woman. And so I just carry visually barriers and obstacles that show up. And sometimes, you know, I think we find, particularly in Louisville and in the South and in Kentucky, people are polite, right? Very front porch polite. And most of the time, you don't know that how you look is a barrier until something happens. And we even question at times, like, well, I don't want to assume it's because I'm Black, but it could be, and you don't know. And that's, you know, I think the burden that Black people have carried, and even like Nikki said, you didn't talk about it in the workplace. And if you did, it was that secret water cooler conversation. And, you know, there was this kind of unwritten rule, more than two Black people couldn't gather to talk because what might someone think you're doing or saying? And a lot of that changed, you know, in 2020. But we still have a ton of work to do with this conversation and bringing people along. And I think we've got those that, you know, who are actively pursuing either learning. I think we have seen that. I want to give some credit to those that are wanting to learn, wanting to be educated, wanting to say, I didn't realize I don't have any Black friends or people around me that I actually talk to and know anything more than their name, right? Or what role they may play in my life. And so I think we did have that happening where people started to explore and ask questions. But then you do still have these pockets of people that still don't believe there's any issue, right? And what do you do about that? And that's playing out in your workplace. And some want to draw these lines between work and community and society. That's all blending together. It just is. And to act like, well, that doesn't happen in my company. You know, so part of that exercise with the two paths was by people saying, and we've heard this all the time and still do, you know, I don't see color, right? Well, by not seeing color, you're choosing to ignore the barriers and obstacles that exist for others, right? Marion said, and I love this, it's not, there's nothing wrong with seeing difference. It's when you assign a deficit to the difference. So it's not anything wrong with me being a Black woman. I am proud to be a Black woman. But if I'm a Black woman and I'm aggressive, I'm loud, I'm all these negative things that you've assigned to me, you know, where someone who looks the opposite of me is passionate, right, and driven, right? So that's, I think that's the challenge. And how are we bringing along people into this conversation and on this journey? We have a lot of work to do.
And I love that you mentioned color blindness, because I was actually thinking that in response to both of y'all's comments, how the burden that Black people, especially Black women, have to carry in with them to work, and the refusal to acknowledge that burden is where color blindness stems from. We're like, oh, you don't have a burden because we're all the same and we're a monolith and everybody has the same struggles, so it's not a burden if everybody carries it. And like refusing to acknowledge the specific barriers that we face, as you said from that example, because of the color of our skin. And that goes really well into the next question, actually, which is what aspects of anti-racist work do you think could be particularly challenging to someone wanting to implement anti-racist policies and build anti-racist infrastructure in their professional workplace? And if so, do you have any, not if so, but if you have any, could you offer your thoughts on how we can overcome those obstacles?
So I think yes, and particularly this work, I don't know if any are particularly harder. They're all difficult. I think in taking people on this journey, There's an article I'd love to point you to, and I'll add it in the chat, a link to it. But in the Harvard Business Review, Lachey Ward, who's the executive vice president and chief external engagement officer at Target, did a article about this topic. And she talks about kind of some fundamentals, these like 4 Ps in different areas. It's a great article, but high level, she kind of drills into some of these different places where it's a challenge, and what do you need to get right? And then what are these other areas that are challenges, right? So she started with purpose, like what's your why as an organization? So that, which is a great place to start. Looking at your company values, who are you as an organization? Because at some point, organizations have to decide, where are you going to plant your flag in the sand, right? What are you going to stand for, and what are you standing against? And I think this is becoming more and more necessary from a generational difference. And I'm preaching to the choir here at this point, but millennials and Gen Z even more so, are very values driven. They want to work for organizations that, you know, share the same values that they do. And we've seen, you know, millennials and Gen Z are also far more diverse, right, as a population. Some even identify in this multiculturalism space that maybe their skin tone doesn't actually reflect, but it's how they feel. They're a little more aware of culture and connecting with others, and they stand up for one another. And we saw that this summer. You know, if you looked around Louisville during the protests and everyone's talking about who's out there, it was a lot of white young people, right, that were out there protesting, you know, on behalf of their belief system and their friends and how they feel about it. And companies have to catch up to that, or you won't be able to recruit young talent. You definitely can't retain the young talent that you have. So that's definitely going to be an obstacle when companies think about who are you and what do you stand for. And then, you know, how do you enforce the work that you're doing? You know, everyone says we're going to create a place where everyone belongs. And that sounds great, right? But how do we get past some of these words and move into action? One example, and this came from another chart that was in this workshop led by Marion and Michael, but it talked about kind of what's acceptable forms of racism versus the unacceptable. So we're very clear on what kind of the society states as unacceptable, or correct, unacceptable. But the acceptable forms, things like if there's a Confederate flag on a license plate in the parking lot, right? And so if we say we have this inclusive environment, we want everyone to feel they belong and they're comfortable and bring their whole selves, but you cannot well, we can't police that. We can't enforce that. Well, then are you actually carrying out what you say you want to do? Or are there gray areas where, well, not really, right? So that's just a couple examples. There's other areas of the perspectives of the organization. Are you listening to what the people are saying? Do you understand the Black experience of people in your organization? When you look at where people are in the organization, are all your Black people at the bottom? Are all your Hispanics in a certain area? Are women bottlenecking at certain roles? What does your leadership teams look like? What about your board? And that takes a lot of work. The data is there. They can go find this and look at it. Many companies are sharing it publicly and assigning goals and ambitions to the work that they want to do, but that's definitely a key place. And then obviously around performance. So what metrics do you have in place? Are you tracking this? And how are you holding people accountable? And then there's some key areas she mentions, and like purchasing is one. So around supplier diversity, does your company have any initiatives around that? What are you doing? Do you have goals set? Are you ensuring economic empowerment? Philanthropy, so community engagement. Where are your dollars going? You know, one of the quotes I love, it's Dr. John Marshall at JCPS, show me your budget and I'll show you your values. You know, so challenging your organizations of what are we doing with our dollars, and where do we show up and how do we support policies, practices, procedures, right? Are you combing through those to remove bias? It's not an exercise of placing blame, but rather, hey, we find bias. Are we solutions driven? Are we going to fix it? So those are some of the key areas. I think all of them can be challenging. It just depends on where organizations are on their journey, but definitely working toward that.
I see we lost Miss Nikki. She was having connection difficulties. So I guess for now we'll move on to the next question. And if she comes back, I'll tell her she can answer that if she would like. But also, just a quick transition with something that you had said, Ms. Russell, really resonated with me and reminded me of the question by Rodney King, can we all just get along? And it seems like a great ideal, but obviously, if it was easy to do that, we would have been there by now. And I think even like, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was agreeing with you. Absolutely. I think it's that in theory, things sound good, but in practice, it's a lot more challenging and difficult. I think it's more complex than just, we can just all get along. Well, I think the biggest challenge, we don't know each other. And particularly in the workplace, we don't often spend time actually getting to know one another, right? And understanding who you are as a person. And maybe we actually have more in common than different. Maybe we both have the same background. Our families are similar, same religion, number of kids. Maybe I'm a big family and so are you. Like, we don't spend that time to actually get to know the other person versus getting caught up in my assumptions of you based on what I see.
Exactly. The next question says, have you ever worried that pushes for inclusion, equality, and equity would negatively impact your career? And then if you feel comfortable, could you speak on an instance in which you received pushback for incorporating anti-racist principles into your workplace? Or on the other hand, if your efforts were well received, what concrete things did you implement into workplace culture and the environment?
Okay, so I'll start with the first part. Have I ever been fearful? Absolutely. I think I speak broadly for many diversity professionals. This is a scary role to play. And it's actually a choice on if it's a scary role to play. Early in my career, when I stepped into this role for the first time, I have many amazing coaches around me. And one of them said, what kind of leader do you want to be? He said, do you want to blow out matches, or do you want to be this agitator and disruptor that this work requires? And if
I'm not sure if it's just me, or did it freeze for anyone else, or is it just my
Yeah, hey,
connection?
Sydney. Brandon, is it frozen on your end as well?
Yep, frozen for me too.
Okay, let's see.
first I thought,
Hey, Victoria, we're having trouble hearing you. Do you want to try taking away your video to see if just audio will work better?
Oh, now she logged off too then. Oh my.
Okay, Sydney. Well, we do have one. If people want to go ahead with their questions as Nikki and Victoria are logging back in from different devices. We did have one question come into the chat. Let's see. I'm trying to find it now. If you put it in the Q&A where we can easily find it rather than scrolling through the chat, it was about what Victoria was talking about with the accepted forms of racism. And the question was, do you think accepted forms of racism include law and policy? And I'd love to hear let's see, there comes Nikki. I'd love to hear what Victoria has to say, because it sounds like she was coming from a training on the accepted forms of racism, but I think it probably has to do with matters of degree too. Hey, Nikki and Victoria.
sorry about that. I'm having connection issues. Can you hear me?
No, yeah, no worries. We'll let you go ahead and try to finish the answer you were on. But then we had a great question about what you said with the accepted forms of racism. And the question was, do you think that includes law and policy? So I'll go ahead and just, since we were talking about that, I'll put it out there if you want to loop it into one of your answers before we move officially to Q&A.
So when you say the law and policy, can you clarify the question?
That was all that came into the chat. It says, what you mentioned about accepted forms of racism, do you think that includes law and policy? Maybe, I don't know, let's see if she clarified down at the end. No, but maybe the idea about like, would there be acceptable forms of racism in the workplace in terms of like law? How do you police what's acceptable forms of racism in terms of policy that are made in the workplace?
You know, on that, I have seen where I think from a legal standpoint, there's been hesitation on how they enforce it, whether either how they enforce it or how they want to position language around things. There have been a number of reverse racism or reverse discrimination lawsuits that pop up from time to time. One very visible one was, I think it was Google, might have been last year or the year before, where they really focused on their diversity metrics, what they wanted to hit. And people would say, well, I'm not getting the job because I'm a white male, that you're only going to hire Sydney. So I feel discriminated against. And I think that is an uncomfortable space for any company to be in. From a legal perspective, very conservative and want to avoid all these lawsuits, right? But again, it's figuring out how far do you want to push to do the right thing? What does that mean? And I think on that journey, though, it does include levels of education across the board of how you do it. So, you know, for example, if you said we want to, Beam actually has a wonderful goal of, you know, 50% female representation, right? And someone could feel like, well, because I'm a man, you have now created this artificial glass ceiling. This metric, one, is to align more like the communities we serve and the customer base that we have, correct? But I think some of the challenges is sometimes to explain it. We're not just hiring women for female sake, right? We want to create opportunity that didn't previously exist. We want to correct some imbalances that might have existed or biases that existed in the recruiting process, in the hiring process, in the promotion process. And I think pushing for that and explaining how you do it is really important. Otherwise, you will get this pushback that now there's a glass ceiling, right, for white men, that they feel, right, they're starting to feel the balance get corrected, and it is painful. It's a painful transition, I think. So I think to answer, I hope that answers her question. I don't know if Nikki, because Nikki's got a more extensive legal background, wants to add to that.
Yeah, so I've said somewhat unpopularly that in the area of advancing equity and righting wrongs and resetting patterns, that the remedy to years of unfairness is years of unfairness. So because our systems and our structures and our patterns and belief systems in the country are so rooted in Black people and brown people being less than and white people being better. That is just a fundamental premise upon which every single system in this country is based. Our education system, healthcare system, workforce system, policing, all of that. It's based on that premise somewhere embedded in there. So any attempt to right that wrong will feel wrong. It will feel like it is unfair. It will feel like it is unbalanced. And that's really where the appetite, that's what I wonder what our appetite is, our courageous appetite is as a country, and certainly in the workplaces, to move organizations through the period that it will take to try to strike that balance and to deal with the imbalance that has been, you know, burdening this country for such a long time.
Thank you. We're actually going to now move into audience Q&A, and we have a few more questions. The first one, it's the one that got upvoted the most. It's by Eliza Sayers, and they ask, how can an entry-level employee implement anti-racism in a workplace corporate setting?
One place to start is, you know, creating employee resource groups or business resource groups in your organization. That helps to give a voice to that community within the company. It can be very difficult depending on your level. So if you're entry level, getting exposure, getting your voice heard, right, and not feeling diminished or marginalized when you do it. So I think sometimes finding that space within employee resource groups, or if your company has a D&I council or pushing for a D&I council, if that doesn't exist in your company, a first place to start could be with the chief HR officer. If you can get access to the CEO to make sure it's top of mind. If those things aren't in formation or exist after 2020, you know, that's as Nikki said, at what point do we stop giving grace, right, for levels of intentional ignorance at this point, right? So I think if companies are getting that started, hopefully they're listening to their people and finding ways to get that elevated.
And if I just could add really quickly, what I love about this moment is that, and particularly the younger generations, is that so all of the generations under me are just far more emboldened, far more emboldened. And so that coupled with a view toward anti-racism could be very powerful in terms of insisting that workplaces honor what you need from work. So there's a duality in work, like we give something to work, but we expect something back beyond the paycheck, beyond the benefits. And so even if in the context of the interview process, asking questions about, so talk to me about how you view anti-racism here. Can you tell me can you give me some examples of where employees have asked questions around inclusion and diversity that have made leaders uncomfortable and how that's been handled? Where are you in the maturity curve with your employee resources groups? That would be really helpful for me to know. What is your point of view and your stance, your public stance on the role of the evolution of diversity and inclusion and equity and anti-racism? What are your training programs? How do you help, unearth systems and processes and even belief systems in the workplace where racism and racist values are at play? So these are the kinds of questions that, nobody would think, like, career enders, right? We would think that there's just no way that there's any employer that wants to be held to task for those kinds of questions. And yet they're so fundamental. They're so fundamental for people, not just Black and brown people, but for people who believe in this work, who want to be in a workplace where they're not constantly battling back messages of unimportance and insignificance as it relates to something that's so incredibly core to who they are.
Definitely. And what you just said, Miss Nikki, it reminded me of like when one group benefits, everyone benefits, but specifically like Black people in the corporate setting. Like, why wouldn't you want like talented Black people to succeed? And the fact that, obviously due to systemic reasons as well, like there's a reason why Black people are kept down, and it's because it's purposeful, whether it's considered unintentional or not. In my opinion, it's purposeful at the end of the day, if you know it or not. But yeah, the next question that was asked is by Hunter Graham, and they say, how common is it for companies to push a lot of talk of anti-racist values but not actually put any support behind it? This is honestly a problem that I feel U of L has.
I think it's incredibly easy, right? Talk is easy. I think some may have been pushed prematurely on their journey into this conversation due to what was happening in 2020. So some companies got called out, right, for putting up the Black square, but had never done anything in their organization. Even Nike got called out at one point for, putting the Black square. And in theory, we often see a lot of their work around Colin Kaepernick and everything that goes on. But then I think it was a white woman called them out and said, well, look at the diversity of your leadership team and your board. And then it's that aha moment, right? So I think people are starting to question at all levels of your company, what are you doing? What's your supplier diversity strategy? Where do you show up in the community? Like, people want to know, where do Black people or other people of color sit in your organization? So it's so much easier to declare values. I think where the rubber meets the road is turning that talk into action, which is actually a lot more difficult, because when you really start getting into this work, and Nikki got into that a bit, it's challenging, and you're going to get pushback internally. You could get pushback externally. You could have lawsuits. You could have people leave the company. At what point do you say, this is who we are, and if you no longer align to these values, you are free to go. We hope you remain a customer of our products, but you are promoted to leave, right? When do you put that stake in the ground and say, this is who we are and what we're going to do? I think it's scary. A lot of companies worry, what about alienating, this other larger customer base, right? So if we start speaking anti-racism, do we lose consumers? You could. Are those consumers you wanted? Right? And then what's the opportunity to pick up consumers you never had? And that's where from a multicultural marketing perspective, I look at your marketing teams, who's helping you understand, who the consumer base is now, and then who's your future consumer base. You might pick up consumers that you never thought you could have, right, for your brand. And so I think doing that work is really important for companies to understand the upside to doing this work. And I don't know these numbers off the top of my head, but the percentage of people who favorably felt about the phrase Black Lives Matter. So I think the first time they did it might have been 2016. It was awful, right? Everyone felt like it's this hate group, right? This terrorist group. Now, the majority of Americans actually view that phrase more favorably, but some will make you still feel like, oh, they're this, they're that. You got to be careful where you get your news, right? But from a data perspective, people are starting to understand what it is and what it means really. And so I think that's an important journey to take people on to start getting to action.
I agree with all of that. I just want to add that there's this other little nuance though that helps me understand when companies really aren't putting their money where their mouth is, or putting infrastructure around where they say their ideology is. And that is around, we see now a lot of people, Black women, Black folks are being hired into companies to be both Black and excellent. But once you get into the company, you're not permitted to be either. And so when I talk about being Black, there's things that are just a part of our culture, by and large, not all of us, but we tend to be, Black people tend to be more expressive. We tend to be a little louder. We tend to be more animated, using our hands a lot. I know I do. But a lot of times in most corporate settings, they kind of coach that out of you because the white social norms don't know what to do with Black expression, Black passion, Black excitement when it shows up. It shows up as offensive. It shows up as scary. And so one of the things that I'm really proud of is that I know a couple of companies that are beginning to unpack what is the Black lived experience here, specifically the Black lived experience first, because that would help us illuminate what some of the other lived experiences might be, but starting with the most marginalized group. So from the time that people apply for a job to the time that they exit, what about being Black feels very different than any other experience of employees here? So I think that's the work that impresses me. Not that you've just hired, somebody that you're not going to give any resources to lead the 2-person diversity team and never be able to get on a flight anywhere to go meet with any of the customers, or never gets any access to the CEO. I'm not impressed with that. But I'm impressed with the folks that are really sitting back and unpacking their own bias and their own prejudices, recognizing that they are already here. Like there's no if, they're here. How do we figure out where they are and get rid of them?
Nikki, and this kind of may lead into another question about performative measures, but Nikki kind of hit it. People are starting to understand diversity, so let's hire more, right? But if you hire people into an organization that is not ready for them, they will exit, right? Mm-hmm. And so doing the work to understand that experience, and as she said, from the start to the end, why are they leaving? What even attracted them to come? And then what happened along the way? What is that experience? What is it like for their relationship with their manager? What's happening in their performance reviews? There's data that shows more often than not, Black people actually receive lower ratings, but that impacts your pay and that impacts your promotions. So, what's happening there? What's the promotion velocity for people of color in the organization, particularly Black talent, right? Are they moving up at the same rate or not? And often I find it easier when you want to get past the talk to action, and people may not know where to start. Start with the data, right? Start with the suggestions that you gave around understanding the experience, and then identify what are we going to do about it. I think it's important that you communicate that, because then you can be held accountable for it. So create the plan, create some metrics that you're going to be accountable for, and treat this work like you do any other business function. I think that's probably the most important for companies. Nowhere else, like in finance, you're not going to set some goals and then be like, I don't know how to get there, or not set goals that you're going to hold yourself to, right? But for some reason in this D&I space, it gets really fluffy. And a lot of the work is kind of like a feel good, but who's really feeling good, right, in the work that you're doing? Or does it give you some great PR messages, right, that people internally don't have that experience, which can also be very problematic and can kind of come back to bite you? So there's so much work that has to be done in this space to take the talk. And then the last question I even ask as people reflect, who's talking? Who are you talking to in the organization? Where are you getting your feedback? Because sometimes you'll hear that work is being created and like hardly any Black people or women or whoever are even included. So I think that can be definitely a challenge.
Can I just add, let me just add one other thing. I know you got to get to some more questions, but this is an important point. Victoria talked about performance reviews. My background is in human resources and law. And so what I have seen in my career and experienced personally is that there is, if companies do nothing else, whoever's on this call, and if you are representing an organization, if you leave this call and do nothing else, go back and look at performance reviews of folks who receive discipline or correction. Call it the last 5 years, white, Black. Just start there, white, Black, discipline, correction. More often than not, people of color, Black people, are written up for not what they did wrong, but what they are perceived to be. Versus white people are written up for, like, you missed a deadline, you didn't show up to the meeting, your stuff was late, you didn't do what I asked you to do. Black people are written up because of how they are perceived by white people, more often than not. So it's you're too intimidating, you're too talkative, you're not a team player, you're not viewed as. So it's the this constant expectation that you're contorting and manipulating yourself into this mold that is palatable. It's not even so much about the work, it's about your perception of whether you're worthy to do the work. And that flies, like that passes HR snuff, that passes, the CEO can look at it, because I don't know that they're paying enough attention to understanding the patterns that are coming from that. But often that's what we see in workplaces. And that's indicative of an organization that is clearly nowhere near talking about anti-racism, maybe even getting past diversity is a stretch for them. So they're a little immature in their sophistication on this journey.
And a lot of people are resonating with that in the chat, the sort of subjective versus objective offenses, as Ryan Simpson put it. But even an example is like in the field of education, Black teachers, when they get walkthroughs or an evaluation, it's often, oh, like you seemed intimidating, so you get points taken off. Whereas a white person likely wouldn't have that on their evaluation, or that wouldn't even be thought of as something to critique them for, because it's assumed that they can never be that.
That also comes up in how you get promoted. Often Black people and people of color get promoted on what you've done, and your white counterparts can get promoted on what they're capable of doing, which is very different. And so this need to feel like you have to constantly prove that you're worthy versus you are talented enough to get to the next level and perform. Because everyone who's hired, no one knows what you actually will do, right? Or what you're truly capable of until you get in the role. And so if that bias sits in the interview process and we're not going to really understand what Sydney can do in the future, right? And then often, if you're not resourced and prepared and developed, in the same way, that also creates some incredible disparities. Sometimes, and assuming positive intent, when people are mentored in their organizations, it's often by someone who has this likability factor with you, or you're like me, I see myself in you, right? So I take you under my wing. And so often for Black people and women, and particularly Black women, there's this challenge of there's no one that looks like you above you to want to take you on that journey, right? To see themselves in you. You struggle. And it's not that it can never happen or that it doesn't happen, but it happens a lot less.
And actually, the objective versus subjective quote is actually from Miss Marion. She said she signed in under someone else's Zoom account. But hi, Miss Marion. But yeah, so I'm gonna ask the last question of the night. Before I do, I just want to thank you all so much for your time and just dedication to the work that you all do in your fields in the corporate realm. It's very much needed. I mean, including just for people like me that are my age and who are wanting to enter these realms, but need trailblazers to make it more comfortable to do so. But yeah, so the last question is, what advice would you give to students and employers wanting to contribute to the diversification and inclusivity of the corporate world? And what do you have to say to the often implied image given to young professionals that activism will be frowned on in the workplace, and that activists and advocates for social justice should keep their activism separate from their professional careers?
I think if companies really want to move forward, those two things have to commingle. I don't think you can leave your activism outside. And if anything, done right, it can help accelerate the organization and end up driving sales, right? And profit, which is the ultimate goal of most publicly traded companies. And so, I think there's some finesse in how you do it. But I don't like this idea of conforming or adapting into organizations. I'll give Marion another shout out. I loved how she explained this journey of diversity to inclusion to belonging. And so often you hear, diversity is just counting people, right? It's being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. But the way she talks about this was, you're often told to be included into a pre-existing organization or culture, right? You need to conform to be included in it. Belonging is taking that a step further, that we can really co-create the culture and having a voice and this drives to do it, right, as your individual self. There's often a risk for this bring your whole self to work concept, particularly for Black people. What does that really mean, to really bring my whole self? Like, can I really wear my hair the way I want? Can I talk the way I do? As Nikki said, if we're expressive with our hands, does that mean I'm aggressive or too much or too intense? How do I not constantly be mindful of covering or code switching, which is exhausting and actually deters you from bringing your full self, and your level of creativity, innovation, productivity, right, is all hampered because you're always mindful of how do I look and how do I sound, right? How do I just be who I am in this organization? I give your generation kudos, because often you just are who you are and you just naturally bring your whole self and you don't really care. And I think more of you are doing that organizations are shifting to you. That's a conversation I'm having within my current and in my prior organizations. When Gen Z comes in, Gen Z is going to be a third of the workforce in 4 or 5 years. So when that starts to happen, they're going to demand and require organizations to be a certain way and to show up a certain way and to create the space that they want to work in. And so either that's going to be a painful experience for your organization, particularly if you wait to get it right, or you can start that journey now. Talk to those people now, create that space now, and be successful.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say, I would encourage students to be emboldened around the following argument. Racism is an economic issue. We have surpassed the point where we can just relegate this to social justice or even a criminal justice conundrum. This is an economic issue. By 2045, minorities will be the majority. That means Black and brown people will have to make up the workforce. We need a robust middle class, earners between 70,000 and 150,000. We need Black and brown people who are earning that in a sustained way. That means they have to be incorporated in work, progressing in work in America's workplaces. Otherwise, the entire health of our economy crumbles. We have always been a country whose economic footing has rested on the health of our middle class. And we've had the luxury for the last several hundreds of years to rely on white faces to be in white spaces, workspaces, to help embolden that. We no longer have that luxury. We only have 20 years to get this together. 21 years, I don't know what my math is. By 2045, that's how long we have to get this to right the ship. And so there is an economic argument to activism, and there isn't an organization or an individual among us that can afford to not be a part of it.
Well, that puts us at 7:30. So unfortunately, I'm gonna have to go ahead and cut off this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much to Nikki and Victoria for your time. I can't imagine two better speakers. This was recorded, and so will be available to everyone through the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies YouTube channel. We'll also create a highlight reel for those who are interested. If you want to share your email in the chat, we'll go ahead and get that piece that Victoria mentioned from the Harvard Business Review. We'd be happy to
just post it in there so if they can.
Perfect. But Sydney, I also want to say thank you to you for taking the time. I can't imagine a better moderator. You were just phenomenal. So thanks so much to all of our speakers. There's 2 more upcoming events in the All Eyes on Louisville series. Thursday, March 4th at 7, How Racism Affects Public Health and Health Outcomes. And then Thursday, March 25th at 7, Race, Class, and Gender in and Through Sport. Thanks again so much for taking the time this evening. Everyone have a good evening.